Welcome to Asia in Review at ThinkTech Hawaii, coming to you from Pioneer Plaza at downtown Honolulu. I'm your host, Jiang, Associate Professor of Geography from University of Hawaii at Manoa. And my guest today is Professor Jonathan Padwe, also from University of Hawaii at Manoa. And our topic today is War and Recovery in Northeast Cambodia. Dr. Jonathan Padwe, Assistant Professor of Anthropology at UH Manoa, is an environmental anthropologist. And his work is about the relationship of human beings and the environment in Southeast Asia. And in today's discussion, we'll learn from his current research in Cambodia, looking at the ways the Jiang people of Cambodia's northeast highlands have recovered from the upheavals of the Vietnam War and the Cambodia genocide during the mid-20th century, and also learning about the current round of changes in land use, society, and culture. And Jonathan, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
I really look forward to learning about your work, which is so important. And as we get to the show, our viewers would understand. I understand you study a small area in northeast Cambodia, but it's about the whole Cambodia, also about the world, and I want to start that way. One of the news I read about Cambodia recently is about the land grab that's happening in Cambodia.
Right.
So apparently the Cambodian government is trying to develop the rural area. And one of the ways they develop this area is to give the land away to some of the developers. And here I quote from this news. The government has signed off almost 600 square miles of Cambodia's arable land to investors, including major Chinese and Vietnamese companies and local firms, which ties to the Cambodia government People's Party, apparently. Corruption is going on there as well. But this is about 2/3 of the land, arable land in Cambodia that's conceded to investors. And also the article talks about the impact on the local people, the violence going on there. And so maybe you can help us to, first of all, talk first a little bit about your work in northeast Cambodia, about the Jiang people, and how that work is related to these large changes that's happening in Cambodia.
Sure. I think a really important thing to understand is that currently these land concessions that you're mentioning, there was a recent law, the Economic Land Concession Law, that allowed for the awarding of these large concessions to businesses. Usually these are businesses with funding from outside of Cambodia, and they have the use of this land for a long period of time. They pay very little rent or no rent on it. And unfortunately, the major problem there is that there are people living on this land.
Including the people you study.
Including the people I study, that's right. And it's also in urban areas where you have really high densities of people with very little, they don't have the paperwork to show that they own the properties that they've lived on for most of their lives, many of them. So, and yes, where I work up in northeast Cambodia, this is also a major problem. The UN has appointed actually a High Commissioner for Human Rights in Cambodia, who has come through on numerous occasions and done reports on the extent of this awarding of land. And it's been devastating, really, for the people whose land is essentially taken from them. I'm sure we'll talk about it, but up where I work, this is also a major issue for people.
And what's amazing to me is that this is just the current round of change that's happening and affecting the Jiang people. And you're going to talk about earlier, wars, all this devastation that's happening in this area, the Vietnam War and the genocide, and how all of those are affecting this area of Jiang. But maybe first you can tell us, who are the Jiang people and how come you're interested in them?
Sure. The Jiang are an ethnic minority group. They're in much of Southeast Asia, there's an incredible cultural diversity. You have so many different languages being spoken, so many different religions practiced, cultural practices are different across so many of the different groups. This has always been a challenge for the states of Southeast Asia to try to incorporate this diversity into the national culture. So the Jiang are a highland minority group. That means that they're up in the hills of the northeast part of Cambodia, which is this area that connects across to the central highlands of Vietnam.
Maybe we can bring up the map.
Yes.
Right? Map number 1, please.
So the specific area where I work is north of the Se San River in this somewhat remote area of rolling hills that connects up to this spine of mountains that is the central highlands of Vietnam, and it's an area that the hills of Southeast Asia have for a long time been very difficult for the lowland states to control, and it's a sort of a hinterland off on the borders of Cambodia and Vietnam.
I'm sure we'll get to it. A lot of the changes that's happening on the land itself has to do with the forest, right?
Yes. Yeah. These highland areas have been less suitable to growing the lowland, rain-fed or irrigated agriculture that's the source of these incredible grain harvests that allowed for the kingdoms like the Angkorian kingdom to emerge over time in these areas. So you really have this situation in Southeast Asia and much of Southeast Asia where the lowlands are the places where you find intensive agriculture and you find state societies like the Cambodians, Vietnamese. The states are in the lowlands, and in the highlands you have this incredibly diverse area of forested area where people live in much lower densities, much lower population density, and their agricultural system is really much more extensive. And so I study, this is really what I study, is the agricultural systems that these people, their agricultural practices and how those are changing. And if we look at the way that people use nature, the way that they grow food for themselves, it's a really good way of getting the larger story of the social and economic conditions that they live in.
And these hills area also are the people who are considered to be the minority people, ethnic people who have their rights violated all the time.
Yes.
Throughout history, right?
Yeah. So there's a whole bunch of things that are different about the people up in the highlands. They are not practicing Buddhism as their major religion. In fact, they practice a kind of an animist religious set of beliefs that turn on the actions of spirits that live in the forest, in the rivers, in the rocks, in the soil. They're constantly sort of involved in people's lives, but it's a real difference in terms of the way that they think about explain the universe, right?
Would you call them almost like traditional societies? Because if we look at here in Hawaii, some of the traditional views are very similar in terms of the connections and see land as alive and see forests not just as something other, but as part of the community. Right?
Yes, yeah, it's very similar in many ways to that. In fact, I'm relatively new to Hawaii, and I've just been marveling as the more I learn and to see some of the similarities. You know, the highlands of Cambodia are also an area that is essentially since the colonial period, it's been much more difficult for these people to practice their traditional practices because of the sort of coming of these different kinds of the government increasingly active in that area, all kinds of changes that are taking place there. So yeah, I think that's a good comparison. Yeah.
Maybe you can tell us about a traditional agricultural practice of the Jiang people, because then we have a kind of reference point, and then look at what's changed and what happened during all these traumas that's going on after the war.
That's a good place to start. The people practice a form of agriculture that's actually called swidden agriculture, and swidden agriculture, it's practiced all around the world in different places. But what you have this extent of forest land and very few people up there who are trying to eke out a living. So it means that if you want to grow crops, you cut down the forest in a piece of land, you burn it to eliminate competition from other kinds of plants, which we call weeds, right? And then you plant it with rice, and the rice that they use is they call it a dry rice, or it's an upland rice that doesn't require irrigation. They grow rice on this plot and a whole bunch of other things for a few years, and then after that, it gets increasingly hard to grow rice there because you have weeds coming in, the soil fertility declines, and so they allow it to go back to forest over time. They let it fallow, and they'll just sort of, it's also called rotational shifting cultivation. They'll go to another plot and do the same thing, and another plot, and each time that they farm, you have forest filling in behind. So over the long term, it's actually a very sustainable system as long as there are not too many people trying to do it at the same time in the same place.
What's interesting from my understanding is that there's this common misunderstanding of a certain agriculture, because it's also called slash and burn agriculture, because it's a low technology and also low density practice in the hills area. And given what you describe here, it's actually very sustainable, because people would allow these forests to lay fallow and grow back the forest, and when they move to another area, right?
Right. The more scientists, anthropologists, people go out and actually learn about these systems, and the more that we can gain an appreciation of the incredible amounts of technical knowledge and expertise that these farmers have, and how well they've adapted their agricultural practices to the highlands where they live. But for a long period, and through the entire colonial period of Cambodia was a colony of France for a long time. During this time, these agricultural practices were considered to be primitive. They were considered to be something that needed to be improved upon, and that continues to be the case. So the need to bring development to these areas is predicated on this idea that, well, these people are practicing a very primitive form of agriculture. They need to be educated and brought into the modern world.
So in a way that the French has their notions and misunderstood the traditional practice of the Jiang people, and we actually today have a lot to learn from the Jiang people, from their sustainable agricultural practice.
Very much so. Very much so.
I think this is actually a natural place to take a break, because we're going to start to get into the impact of all these traumatic, did I say that right? Event that's affecting the area, the war, the genocide. So this is Asia in Review at Think Tech Hawaii, streaming live, and today's topic is war and recovery in Northeast Cambodia, and we'll be right back after a very short break.
Aloha, I'm Jay Fidel, founder of Think Tech Hawaii. We are a digital media nonprofit that covers things that matter to tech, energy, diversification, globalism, and progress for our state, the state of Hawaii. We broadcast on community television and on Oceanic Cable Channel 16. We also stream our shows and interviews live on the internet as both radio and video, and of course we post them here on YouTube. We collaborate with the Hawaii Venture Capital Association to present monthly luncheon programs on subjects of interest to the business community, and we write for the Honolulu Star Advertiser. ThinkTech works hard to raise public awareness in Hawaii. Check out our website, thinktechhawaii.com, and come to our YouTube channel, Think Tech Hawaii. We hope you support our mission and that you like our work. I'm Jay Fidel. Mahalo.
Hello, we're back. We're live, coming to you from Pioneer Plaza at downtown Honolulu. And I'm your host, Jiang, and this is Asia in Review at Think Tech Hawaii. My guest today is Professor Jonathan Padwe, Assistant Professor of Anthropology from UH Manoa, and we've been talking about war and recovery in Northeast Cambodia. So before the break, we just learned about the kind of way of life the Jiang people lived traditionally. And let's get into the impact. You know, the first major impact we are dealing with today is the Vietnam War.
Okay, absolutely.
So how do you summarize the impact?
Well, in the highlands, the area where the Jirai live, although it's always been considered something of a remote hinterland, in fact was a critical location for the Vietnam War. And by the Vietnam War, I think here we're talking about the American Vietnam War, the 1960s and 70s, when the northern Vietnam had already been liberated from French control. It was, they were attempting to help the South Vietnamese communists, who we call the Viet Cong, or called the Viet Cong, to also get out from under American-backed control of the South Vietnamese government, to reunite Vietnam. And they were bringing supplies down through the territory of Laos and Cambodia, through this highland area, which was covered with trees, outside of really the realm of the reach of the states of Cambodia and Laos, and so much easier for transporting personnel, weapons, supplies down to the armies in the south. So the Americans were really trying to prevent the flow of materiel down south through this area.
And so this is your study area, as we saw in the early map. It's right adjacent, close to the border with Vietnam.
Right.
And that's where it's becoming like the battlefield, so to speak. Yeah.
Yeah.
So maybe we can bring up map number 4. Is this it?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay.
So what you can see in this map is that these are maps based on American intelligence during the war. It was written up by the Army after the war based on interviews, and they studied what they knew at the time. And what they discovered was that there were numerous Vietnamese communist troops operating right in that border area along the border, right where the people who I study live, the people who I work with in my research. And they had identified not only these routes, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which brought supplies from the south, and also a sea route called the Sihanouk Trail, you can see on that first map, but that there were also a series of enemy base camps, areas they'd identified as enemy base camps, places where the enemy, the Viet Cong, were in great number. They may have had hospitals, they may have had weapons caches, that kind of thing, hidden away up in the hills and under cover of some of these villages of Jirai and other highland people up there. And you can see in that last image up on this, this map, the enemy base area 702 is exactly in this area where I work. It's this little area north of the Se San River, right up at the border with Vietnam. And in 1971, well, in the late 1960s, the American and South Vietnamese Army began bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail area with quite a lot of artillery was dropped on this area. And there was even a series of land invasions, including into the area where I work. So the village, the Jirai people move around a village from place to place quite often. And they usually name the old village site after the river that it was next to. In the case of this village that they used to live in, they call it it's in Jirai, the term is Ngo Ni Chu, which means in English, the village the Americans burnt. So this is the place they used to live.
So basically, the war really affected the homeland of the Jirai people, and with all the bombing that's going on in the area. What about landmines?
Landmines were not such an issue, but the bombing was severe. And what eventually happens is that after this brief land invasion in 1971, it was only a few days, but the villages were burnt, people's supplies of rice were burnt or taken away because it was assumed that this was being used to provide food to the Vietnamese communists in the area.
I see.
So an entire year's worth of rice was burned at this time. And it meant that the people had to really live in the forest. They were living in bunkers. They couldn't really live in their villages. They couldn't practice their traditional farming practices or cultural practices. And it's during this period of incredible insecurity that Cambodia's own communist revolution was also operating up in this area. This is
double whammy, you know, they are affected by all these regimes.
Incredible. Yeah, they're caught between all of these different forces.
Were there killing of the Jirai people by the You know, the Cambodian government?
Well, some people were killed in the bombing. It created incredible disruption, and it left them vulnerable. And at that point, this is in the early 1970s, the Khmer Rouge, which is the Cambodian communists, they had quite a lot of power up in this part of the country, and so they forced people out of the hills, out of the forests, out of these areas where they were hiding, down to the river valleys, and set up what were called sahakaw, which means it's an agricultural collective. And this was the beginning of collectivized agriculture in Cambodia that would later become what we call the killing fields. And if you know that movie.
Oh, I see. So basically, after the Americans left, the Vietnam War ended.
Right.
Then these Jiang people were affected by a different regime, and they were moved to the lowland.
Right.
So basically, now they totally left their forest home.
That's right. And in fact, even though the American-Vietnam War was still going on, the highlands of Cambodia fell under Khmer Rouge control much earlier than the rest of the country. So 1972, as opposed to 1975, was the fall of Phnom Penh. So that's right. There's all of these things going on at the same time. It's an incredibly turbulent period. And right at that moment is when the Jiang of all of the villages that are up here in this area, they were all relocated, and everybody was put to work growing wet rice, which is a completely different kind of agricultural system again.
Wow.
Yeah.
So these people have gone through so much.
Yes.
We're going to come back to hopefully learn more about some of these impact. So then if we move along history, when did they get back to the forest again?
Right. In fact, the sort of, just to sort of catch up on the history a little bit, so between 1973 and 1979, they're under the control of the Khmer Rouge. The Khmer Rouge took control of all of Cambodia from 1975 to 1979. In 1979, the Vietnamese army actually came in and retook Cambodia and installed a government of Cambodian, basically military leaders who had left and come over to Vietnam to escape the Khmer Rouge. But they were former Khmer Rouge themselves. Put back into power, and by the so throughout the 80s, we really had this Vietnamese-backed government in place. And during much of that time, they did not allow people to go back up into the highlands. So even though the Khmer Rouge were gone, the Jiang people were left to fend for themselves somewhat down in the lowland areas where they were a little bit closer to government services, to the places where the soldiers had control of the country, the security situation was better. And it's only after, say, 1990 that people actually start going back up to the hills fully and putting back together this life that had been interrupted.
That's right. So when they were on the lowland, they basically have no connection with their traditional way of life anymore.
Well, you know, this is really what I thought. This is the story I'm telling you. This is the story that I'd heard, and this was one of the things that really drew me to try to understand better what had been going on. Because what I understood was that their traditional way of life had been completely interrupted, and in many ways that's true. But you know, it's also one of these things where we hear these stories, and when we actually dig in a little deeper, the reality is so complex. So on the side, in little plots, they were doing a little bit of their old systems of agriculture. And
I see.
after the Khmer Rouge period was over, they were allowed to practice their traditional religious practices again. So there was a lot of trying to make up for lost time and holding big ceremonies. And so people were gradually putting back together some of the pieces, but it's really not until they get back up into the highlands in the 90s that they're finally saying, hey, we need seeds to grow our old crops again. We need to we need to buy some of the traditional ritual items that are part of our ceremonies, like they have gongs and these Chinese jars that they use as part of their ceremonies. They drink alcohol out of. So.
I see. So we want to learn more about these rituals and feasts in a little bit. So if we follow the timeline, now in 1991 they went back to the hill.
Yeah.
Talk about the current round of change,
Okay.
because that's when we started with the land grab.
Right. So the 1990s in some ways represent a period of opportunity for these people. They're finally, the security situation is such that they can basically go about their lives somewhat without the kinds of controls that have been placed on them for the past 20 years. They reestablish their agricultural system through incredible amounts of ingenuity, right? Finding seeds from relatives over in Vietnam, from other people,
Oh, wow.
putting this whole system back together. And it's one of these great untold tales of, it's really amazing what they were able to do.
So they try to go back to their Sweden agricultural kind of practice,
Yeah.
with the seeds, the kind of crops they raise there.
Right, and this is an agricultural system that is incredibly complex. It has all kinds of different components and a lot of what scientists call agrodiversity.
Yeah.
So it's a diverse system. There's many different rice varieties that people use, many different varieties of other kinds of crops, each one of them sort of well adapted to a particular place, and a lot of innovation going on. And so the Jirai were really the people that I work with, this village. I talk to people a lot, like, where did the seeds come from? How did you do it? And they really told me these stories of having gone and visited relatives who were far away, asked for seeds, brought a few back, developed these varieties all over again. So that was what happened during the 90s, and then into the late 90s. Then we should talk a little bit about the kinds of rapid economic changes that happen as part of Cambodia's development and modernization, which is really what starts to happen at that period.
Let's do this. Let's take another quick break, and when we come back, let's
Okay.
dive right into it. This is Hong Jiang at Asia in Review, and we've been speaking about war and recovery in northeast Cambodia. We'll be right back after this short break.
Aloha, I'm Nicole Horry for ThinkTech. For nearly half a century, the Hawaii Foreign Trade Zone No. 9 has brought the benefits of the Foreign Trade Zone program to Hawaii businesses and entrepreneurs. DBET, the Department of Business, Economic Development and Tourism, operates Hawaii's Foreign Trade Zone program to encourage international business and economic development. The Foreign Trade Zone's mission is to increase the amount of international trading activity in Hawaii, thereby providing employment opportunities for the residents of our island state. For more information, see ftz9.org. I'm Nicole Horry. Mahalo.
We're back. We're live, coming to you from Pioneer Plaza at downtown Honolulu. I'm your host, Hong Jiang. This is ThinkTech Hawaii. And we've been talking with Professor Jonathan Padwe from University of Hawaii at Manoa about war and recovery in northeast Cambodia. So before the break, we were just talking about the Jirai people with their ingenuity coming back to the hills area and try to recover the very richly diverse Sweden agricultural system.
Right.
And then you'll talk about another round of interruption.
Right. So there's a period now in the 90s and the early 2000s where the old villages are finding their way back up into these territories that had been their traditional territories. And this is not sort of marked out on maps and with land titles and this kind of thing, but was just this sort of traditional set of arrangements. Each village knew where their land was. The village elders, these sorts of councils within each village were sort of in charge of the rules and regulations over all of this stuff. In the 1990s, there is a timber boom throughout much of Southeast Asia. Many of the different sort of political factions in Cambodia were funding their activities through use of timber extracted from some of these forested areas. So this is really an early wave of modernization and development. This is not to say that there hadn't been other sort of activities that brought these people into. They were part of the modern world, but this timber extraction that took place in the 90s was very important because it brought in a bunch of timber concessionaires. It brought in Khmer, Cambodian migrants, so people from the lowlands who had been displaced partly because of this history of war were now looking for opportunity following this wave of timber work in the timber concessions. After the trees were many of these sort of valuable species, which were valuable to the Jiang people as well as to the timber companies, had been removed, you have what begins to happen is that there's land speculation. Some of the different Cambodian waves of immigration, people are settling down, they're establishing businesses, and part of what they're doing is buying land because you have the emergence of state-backed private property in land, so a competing system of land ownership, and the Jiang claims to some of their land, they're actually not able to maintain those claims in the face of some of these new some of the new practices that are going on, where you have people coming in, buying land, getting land title, and it trumps the traditional set of arrangements there.
I think the land claim is an important point over here. You talked about it earlier that there wasn't a land title kind of system to the Jiang people.
Right.
So basically they live on this traditional homeland, but they don't have entitlement to the land itself. They don't have rights to the property, so to speak. So does that mean the state can just allocate it to anybody they want?
That's right. That's right. And that's where this issue that we started our discussion with comes back into play, because one of the ways that the Cambodian government has sought to bring development to a country that they feel that they need to develop the economy. One of the ways that they've tried to do that is by encouraging different kinds of industrial agricultural practices, the development of different kinds of agricultural enterprises on large scale in places where that's possible.
So you're talking about rubber, you're talking about timber production.
Yes, and especially rubber right now. The market for natural rubber is actually quite vibrant. There's a real need for natural rubber, especially with the expanding Chinese economy. So there's this is a valuable commodity, and Cambodia has pretty good environment and climate for producing rubber. And so what you have now is many of the economic land concessions that have been granted throughout the country have gone into places where property rights are not the formal property rights that you might have in some of the more densely populated area, but are these property rights systems that are traditional or collectively managed areas.
And not protected by the state, so to speak.
Not protected by the state, and in fact, the perfect place to site a rubber plantation, some sort of industry like this, just very much because those rights don't exist.
It's almost like the Jiang people on their land now is invaded by another kind of war, and now it's waged by the government, the business people from China, from Vietnam, from other areas in Cambodia, and this is another kind of a difficult experience they have to go through. Maybe we can bring up map number 5.
Yeah.
And that shows the concession area.
Yeah, this is an image that shows the 2 major rubber concessions that have been placed right on top of these villages, and you can see the agricultural land is being really confined by this. This is area of forest that would have been used by the people to expand their agricultural land in the future. And now it's no longer available to them, and instead has been completely destroyed. Actually, I've watched over the time that I've been working with the people in this village as they see bulldozers coming through their traditional forests and taking out this entire set of resources that they rely very heavily on. So it's been very difficult for them to try to understand and adapt to these new circumstances, and it's also, as you say, it's yet another example of larger geopolitical forces intervening on this area that, seems remote, but is actually at the center of a whole confluence of things that are going on in the larger world.
That's right. Yeah. So talking about your research is about this small group of people in a hills area in northeast Cambodia, but they are really living with all these streams of influence. That's almost like they're living at the center of the world.
Yeah.
Yeah. How do they adapt? How do they now? They have a less land to work with, and you have a higher population density now. And how does I'm sure it's there's so many things the society has changed.
Yeah.
In land use, how do they have to adapt?
That's a really important question. This is something I'm very interested in, to understand what they're doing, because as we noted, they're considered to be backwards people, uneducated and not sophisticated. And yet, as I was telling you, their ability to reintroduce their complicated and very sort of diverse agricultural system back to this area shows a certain level. It shows ingenuity, it shows a dynamism of their agricultural practices. And in the same way, they've been acting themselves to get into the economies that are available to them. So now they've taken on cashew farming as one strategy to allow them to intensify that agricultural system. They don't have as much land to fallow anymore. So instead of letting their old fields return to forest, which might actually, they might not have rights to, they've been growing cashews behind, right? So they'll farm rice for a few years, and then they'll plant cashew in the rice, and then they have a cashew plantation that provides an income for 20 or 30 years.
So that is a kind of a form of a commodity that they used to be subsistence agriculture. Now they're entering into the market, right?
That's right. That's right. And they're now producing cashews. They've always produced sesame for a little cash income, but now they've really gone in for cashew production, and they're selling the cashew to buyers who come through during the cashew harvest. You have buyers coming through on motorcycles, going to each farm, purchasing cashews, and this has been one of the major sort of strategies that they've used also to sort of establish land rights as well. Because if there's forest sitting on it, the state will claim that it's state land. But if there are clearly a crop on that land, then a certain kind of ownership should be afforded to the person whose crop that is.
Let me just clarify two things. One is that in terms of the larger piece of land that's given to rubber plantation, the Jiang people are not taking advantage of that.
No.
But they are able to try to make do with what they have, and try to change the way of agricultural land practice.
Right.
So in a way that they are the agent of change, they are not just sitting there waiting to be victimized.
Right. And in fact, they have traditionally been in trading relations with the larger world for much of their history. So if you talk to Jiang people about their oral history, they'll really give you a sense for the ways in which they were trading up and down the rivers out to the oceans. And this is common of many of the highland people in all of Southeast Asia. And today, they are engaged in world markets. They're producing cashews. It's a major agricultural commodity. They're producing cashews, which are being processed now in Vietnam. And as a result, partly of the cashew agriculture in Cambodia, Vietnam's become one of the principal exporters of cashew worldwide. So again, participating in these much larger ongoing currents of world history.
So again, they are not just the marginal people. They are on the center of the world stage. Yeah, so to speak. That's good. So we're going to take our last break, and when we come back, we want to learn more about the Jiang people, their rituals, and their feasting.
Sure.
Yeah. Again, this is Asia in Review at Think Tech Hawaii, streaming live. I'm your host, Jiang, and we'll be right back after this short break.
I'm Bill Spencer, president of the Hawaii Venture Capital Association. We do monthly luncheon programs with Think Tech about things that matter to Hawaii entrepreneurs, investors, and business service providers. So join us on the fourth Thursday of every month at the Plaza Club. For information about upcoming events or to join our mailing list, visit hvca.org. See you there.
Hi, we're back. We're live. And this is Asia in Review at Think Tech Hawaii. I'm your host, Jiang. And we've been speaking with Professor Jonathan Padwe about war and recovery in Northeast Cambodia, and especially about the Jiang people. Maybe this last section, let's learn more about the Jiang people. The producer, can you put up map number 2? We were talking about trying to learn more about the Jiang people, about their cultural practices, and what is this image over here?
Sure. What you're looking at is a group of Jiang men. They're sitting on this sort of elevated platform inside a longhouse. So they actually live in these very long, or they have traditionally lived in these long houses. They're drinking rice beer. It's a fermented rice alcohol that they've made themselves. And this is actually after some form of sacrifice has taken place. This is characteristic of these highland religious practices. You don't just sit around and drink, right? There's something sacred about participating in drinking alcohol, and so these men are participating in one of these ritual feasts.
The next image, please, image number 3.
And this image is a woman who's harvesting dry rice, this upland rice, and the entire agricultural cycle is marked by different feasts, different celebrations. It's considered the productivity of their fields. The people consider that to be produced by the actions of these spiritual beings that inhabit the landscape. And so for every change in the agricultural calendar, it requires a whole set of ritual activities. And I've been really struck by one of the characteristic sort of ways in which I think that they're really confronting their past and trying to maintain their identity as a people is through these kinds of activities.
Is it fair to say that after all these changes, war, genocide, and all these changes in the modern Cambodia society, the Jiang people have been keeping their cultural identity through these rituals, right?
Yeah.
And are these rituals changed in any ways over time?
Yeah. They have changed quite a bit, and it's interesting. On the one hand, they have become somewhat less elaborate. People will leave off some of the things that they would have done previously. So I ask people, why is that? And sometimes they tell me, that you need a whole bunch of special bamboo for this, and we don't have that bamboo near us anymore. So it might be related to environmental change too, or they're busy with the cashew harvest, so they don't really have the time to invest in all of these types of activities. But what's also been interesting to me is to see that some of what we might call modernization has led to an intensification of these rituals. You have local politicians who simply have to ride their motorcycles from feast to feast through the countryside to sort of do their politicking, to shore up their alliances with people. So
that's interesting.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's not just with the current changes they're suffering, and the ritual system is being degraded as a result. It's changing. It's really changing.
We have maybe 5 minutes left to the show. I wanted to get to your perspective about the future of the Jiang people. I know reading your book, and one of the last concluding section, you named it "and the end of the world." I'm sure you didn't mean that, right?
It's interesting. When I was there, there's a long tradition in the highlands of Southeast Asia as well of what we call millennial movements. Right? The belief that the world is about to come to an end. And while I was there, I heard rumors of the end of the world. And there were all kinds of strange rumors circulating that people should kill all of their livestock because they wouldn't need them anymore because the world was really imminently about to end. It didn't happen.
Luckily.
Yeah. But I think some people that I spoke with said, you know, these beliefs, they're tied up in the changes that are going on today. It's a period of rapid change and people feel insecure. And people that I spoke with suggested that in some ways this belief in the end of the world was partly an expression of this insecurity that they feel. And I know when I've been visiting friends, I go back quite often and hang out with people in the village, and you know, they see the changes around them, and I can't say that it's a hopeful period for them right now, because I think that they feel that they're doing their best to adapt to the situation, but they're not sure what the future holds for their children.
What's interesting with this show, with you know, all the knowledge you have about the Jiang people in Cambodia, clearly they are affected by this major event in the world. They are sitting at the center of the world stage. But do they feel that way, you know, vis-a-vis the Cambodian government? And do they feel they are just left, cast aside and not cared for? And how then can they get their rights back, you know, partly about the land?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. You know, the issues that they're involved in are the central issues that affect people in Cambodia. And there's been the recent elections in Cambodia were actually, it was far more difficult for the ruling party to maintain control than it has been in the past. And one of the most important reasons for that has been insecurity around land and people feeling that the government is not protecting their interests. And I do think that the people that I work with similarly feel that they are neglected in terms of being able to reap some of the rewards of the period of prosperity that essentially Cambodia is enjoying, a period of prosperity right now. But for poor people, for people without rights, it is not a period of prosperity in the same way as it is for some other people in Cambodian society.
Any perspective in terms of a political action that would require not just the Jiang people, but other people in the hills area? Is there any kind of a collective movement to call for their rights to be respected in Cambodia, and how that's related to the current development trend of Cambodia?
There are movements. There are movements arranged around ideas of human rights. There are environmental movements that seek to demonstrate the ways that environmental change is affecting people. So one of the major things that's happening in Cambodia is also many of the tributaries of the Mekong River are being dammed, and there's been a great deal of public movement, of action, protests, trying to stop these dams from going forward. Similarly with the land rights issue, as I was saying, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has been involved in trying to advocate for people who are losing their land. It's been only moderately successful. The government has not yet been called upon to respond to these things. So I think there's hope, though, and certainly there is quite a lot of sort of organizing around those issues.
What's interesting to me from what I hear from the story that you told here, the environment may become a kind of a venue of change, collective action, addressing some of the rights issues, which is very, very interesting. Comes back to the field that you're studying, environmental anthropologist, and my field, geography.
Right.
Well, thank you so much. So we're out of time. We have to wrap up. I'm Jiang. This is Asia in Review at Think Tech Hawaii, coming to you from the Pioneer Plaza at downtown Honolulu. And we've been talking with Professor Jonathan Padwe from Anthropology Department at University of Hawaii at Manoa. And we've been learning about war and recovery in Northeast Cambodia. And thank you so much, Jonathan, for being with us here today.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here.
And I want to thank our production manager, Ian Davison, communications director, Chrissy Golfican, and our producer, Jay Fidel, for sure, and our viewers for watching us, tuning in. And see you next Tuesday at Asia in Review. Thank you and goodbye.